Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and today we're going to do two fun walking foot designs, all based on one of my favorite shapes. This quilt behind me is called Bling, and it's made from my Dazzle Dots fabrics. This is one of my popular patterns, and you can really lay it out a lot of different ways. Because I've made it several times, I wanted to try out a new quilting plan when I made this version of it. So I basically took the square spiral combined with the round spiral, and I quilted every other block. But before I did that, first of all, I stitched in the ditch in the vertical and the horizontal seams so that I could hold the quilt together before I added the spirals. Now these spirals are really fun to do and they're very forgiving, but they do require a lot of turning of the quilt. So if you just know that going into it, you're going to have a really good time with it. Now the step-by-step instructions for both can be found in my book, 99 Machine Quilting Designs. But let's get to it so you can see what I'm talking about. So first of all, I'm stitching a wavy line near the ditch rather than in the ditch to anchor the quilt and hold it all together. I will stitch a series of these anchor lines, and the width in between each is going to depend on how big my blocks are. For example, in this version of Bling, I've sewn together 4 of the smaller Bling blocks to form a large hashtag block, so that is where I'm going to use it as my anchor points. I'm just going to stitch in between each of the rows of the larger blocks for now, making a bigger area that I'll come back and fill in with some more custom quilting. Now, when I get to the end of each line of quilting, I'm going to cut the thread and then scrunch up the quilt, shove it over underneath the machine to get to the next line of quilting. So I try to quilt from top to bottom and cut thread at the end of each row of stitching rather than trying to seesaw or going back and forth. Right now, I'm quilting at actual speed because I want you to see and hear how fast I stitch and how much I'm going to stop, start, and reposition the quilt as I go. You're going to actually spend more time adjusting your quilt than you will actually stitching it, and that's totally fine as long as you know that going into it. The important thing is that you want to keep the area in between your hands nice and smooth at all times for pretty even stitches. So I like to start stitching on the right hand side of my quilt and then work my way over to the center. What you're seeing right now, I've already quilted a couple of those lines and now I'm continuing to work my way across the quilt. It's actually easier to keep track of what I'm doing, and it's a lot easier to manage the bulk of the quilt this way by starting off. Now, I have spray basted the quilt ahead of time, so I don't have any pins getting in the way. I do have a separate tutorial for that over on my YouTube channel, so make sure you go check that out if you want kind of a step-by-step process of how that works. I will continue quilting those anchor lines first, and then I can decide ahead of time how close or far apart I want them to be. My sewing machine is set to regular straight line stitching, and my machine has a built-in dual feed foot, which performs the same function as a walking foot, so I use those terms interchangeably. My feed dogs are up or engaged, and I'm wiggling the quilt back and forth to form the wavy lines. I'm also wearing quilting gloves to help grip the quilt, making it easier to push it smoothly underneath my machine. Most quilting issues happen when you can't move your quilt smoothly and slowly underneath the sewing machine. So if you're unencumbered, it really makes it much easier to have nice stitches. Now I'll speed up the video so you can see the same technique on another line of stitching. And don't worry if you can't see the actual stitches, just kind of look and see what my hands are doing and how I'm moving the quilt. The point of the way I like to quilt is that I don't want to see the stitches, so I'm going to use a blending thread so all you see is that really yummy texture. Once I reach the halfway point, I'll stitch to the end of that row of stitching, and then I'm going to rotate the quilt 180 degrees underneath the machine so that I can quilt the rest of the anchor lines back across the other half of the quilt. So this time I'm working from the center back over to the right hand side again, so I never have any more than half of the quilt under the machine at one time. For the first part of the anchor quilting, I was gathering more bulk underneath the machine, and now the bulk is getting less and less as I go. I'll quilt all of the anchor lines in this direction, and then I will finish it up by quilting all of the anchor lines going perpendicular, forming a large grid of stitching across the quilt in between each of the larger blocks. Here's a wider shot where you can see what it looks like as I scrunch, smush, and rotate the quilt under the machine. I'm in my studio a little bit late at night. It's a little bit messy, and I'm focusing but having a good time. With this design, I'm quilting every other block with square spirals, and then I'll go back and quilt every other block with round spirals. So there's a lot of turning for this particular pattern. I'm custom quilting this quilt, which means I'm confining the block motif to each individual block rather than doing an all over edge to edge design. So for this design, I'm going to need to start and stop and cut thread when I'm stitching every single block. So I'm just relaxing, getting all this quilting done, and I'm stitching using my Krista cabinet that I designed with Arrow, and I have these little bumpers around the edges called quilt catchers. They do exactly what they sound like. They keep the quilt from falling off the edge of the table as I sew, and that really helps compensate for friction and drag on the quilt. So here's what the basic design looks like that I am stitching on half of the quilt in every other block. It's a wavy square spiral that's not marked or measured. When I'm quilting it close up with blending thread, it's hard to see the design, so I wanted to draw it out for you so you get the basic idea of the quilting plan that I'm going for. It's a good idea to try stitching this out on a practice sample first so you get an idea of how to form the design. And as in all of my quilting, I sketch out a quick plan, but what I stitch doesn't look exactly what I drew out. It just gives me an idea of what I'm going for. Because my blocks are so large, it's going to take a bit of time to quilt each of these blocks. Whenever I practice or draw out a quilting plan, I'm not trying to recreate it exactly. When I'm quilting on the real quilt, I'll let things be a little bit more random and a little bit more whimsical. But you get to decide how densely you want to stitch it. You can space your lines out further apart, you can add as many wiggles as you like, or you can make them a lot closer together. Whenever I'm machine quilting a real quilt, I give myself plenty of time because I tend to quilt them very densely. Remember, there's no right or wrong way, just do whatever you prefer. By anchor quilting it ahead of time, knowing what my quilting plan is, I'm only focusing on one area of the quilt at a time. So now I'm just going to continue quilting this design for a while, quilting every other block as I go, starting and stopping, listening to some good music or maybe an audiobook or quilting podcast, and just really enjoy the process. As I make my way towards the center of each block, the lines are going to get smaller and smaller, and the process is going to go faster and faster. Yep, it's a lot of rotating, but that's okay. Part of the reason I did this design was an experiment to see how much it bothered me to rotate the quilt, to see if it was doable, and for me, the answer is yes, absolutely doable. Now I want to show you how I tie off my thread tails at the end because I'm doing this on every single block in the quilt. First, I need to give the thread some slack, so I very gently pull the quilt away from the machine without breaking the threads. I'm going to cut off about 6 to 8 inches of thread tails to work with on the top of the quilt. Then I'll flip the quilt over to the back and do the same thing. Cut off a tail of thread that's about 6 to 8 inches long, so it's long enough to tie a knot. Back to the top side again, I will give the top thread a gentle tug to pull up the bobbin thread to the top. Then I will very, very carefully pull up the bobbin thread to the top, maybe using a seam ripper or something pointy to kind of grab that thread and pull it up to the top. Once I have both threads on the top of the quilt, I'm just tying a simple knot close to the bottom of the thread. And sometimes I'll do it again and double knot it for extra security. You can tie all of these off one at a time, or you can wait until the entire end of the quilting and then do them all at one time. Then I will thread both tails through a self-threading needle, also known as a cheater needle. It has a hole in the top or the side, so you can thread it very easily. This makes it much easier, especially when you're doing more than one knot. Finally, I'll take one hand stitch right at the point where I stopped quilting. I'm going to push the needle through only the top 2 layers, the quilt top and the batting, pull it through, and then give the needle a quick tug to pop the knot into the batting, and finally cut off the extra thread tails. Now it's time to quilt the round spiral design. For this design, I'm going to mark this center circle to get started. Then I draw a guideline which represents the spacing between the edge of my foot and the needle. In my case, it's about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. This is going to set the width of my stitching lines, and I can absolutely adjust this if I wanted to make them wider or more narrow. Next, I'll draw a gently curving line from the center circle over to that guideline that I just marked. And this is the only marking I need to do for this design. I'll mark an X right where I'm going to bring up my threads so that I know where to start stitching. I'll pull up my bobbin thread so that it's on the top, and I'll either start with teeny tiny stitches to lock them in place, Or I can leave the long thread tails loose and then go back and tie them off later, just like I showed you earlier when I was quilting the square spiral design. I will slowly and carefully stitch around the center circle. Because I'm using contrasting thread on my practice piece, you're going to see every imperfection. But in just a minute, when I show you how I'm doing this on a real quilt, you won't see that stitching because it's going to blend into the fabrics. Notice how I'm keeping the edge of my foot right next to the previous line of stitching. Doing this the entire time will keep the stitching line smooth, consistent, and even. So the slower you stitch, the easier it is to stay in control. And you can decide how short or long you want your individual stitches to be. When I'm doing walking foot or dual feed quilting, I actually stitch with a slightly longer stitch length of 3.0 because that helps compensate for that friction and drag on the quilt. Once I'm comfortable stitching out this design on a practice sample, then it's time to quilt it on my real quilt. So now that I'm quilting this design on my full-size Bling quilt, I've already marked my center and started that little bit of stitching like I showed you in my practice sample. And of course, it was a lot of rotating of the quilt. But once I get done with those first few inner rounds of quilting, the circle is going to get bigger and bigger, and that's going to help speed things up. I'm quilting at actual speed right now, so you can see how fast or slow this actually goes and what it looks like and sounds like. As I mentioned, this is a lot of turning for each spiral, so it was a big commitment for me to do this in every other block. But again, I wanted to try it out, and so far, so good. I really like the texture that's forming here, so it's worth the work to me. However, I have quilted a continuous round spiral over an entire quilt, so I've been there and I've done that design, and I was ready for more of a challenge with this quilt. Be sure to go back and check out some of my other YouTube videos where I show you how to quilt this design on an entire quilt continuously. And just remember, domestic machine quilting is all about managing your expectations. If you need to get a quilt done quickly, just stitch an all-over edge design. But if you want to experiment, you want to take some time, and you really want to enjoy the process, you can spend the time doing custom quilting like what I'm doing. So one of the reasons I decided to turn 4 of the smaller blocks into one big jumbo block was so that I would have fewer overall blocks to quilt and more surface area. And the fact that I anchor quilted in between each of the large rows of blocks really allows me to jump around the quilt and quilt any block that I want to, because anything that has been anchored or secured in between that first rows of stitching first is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to shift on me. So rather than thinking of me quilting this huge entire quilt, I'm only focusing on one small area at a time. These are the things that I like to think about ahead of time while I'm piecing the top and planning out my quilting. So as I quilt more round spirals, I'm keeping the edge of my foot exactly next to the previously stitched line. Now, I could change the width of my lines by changing my needle position. I could use a guide bar. I could mark out the lines if I wanted to, but this process really works for me. Just be sure to keep the area in between your hands nice and smooth. I call this area where I'm quilting the valley, and the area around my hands are called the hills, so that's where the bulk of the quilt can accumulate. You're only going to focus on that 5 to 6 inches in between your hands, so the rest of it can kind of get all scrunchy and smushy, whatever you want to do. It's totally fine. And just remember, you aren't quilting that whole quilt all at once. You're just focusing on one block, one stitch at a time, and before you know it, you'll be finished. Now I'll speed things up so you can see more of this process, and it's going to be the same thing for every other block in this quilt. I'm going to keep going until each block is finished. I really enjoyed making this version of Bling, and I took it with me on a recent beach vacation so I could get some fun photos while I was relaxing by the sea. I really love how much the dense texture shows up on this quilt, and I'm glad I quilted it as densely as I did. I also love making pieced quilt backs, so I combined leftovers from this quilt along with some leftover scraps in similar colors from other quilts to make an interesting quilt back. Be sure to check the links in the description of this video for some of the other video tutorials I mentioned, and you can find out where to get the Bling quilt pattern, my Dazzle Dots fabrics, and some other really fun things. So grab your materials, give it a try, and let me know what you think.